think the builders' insolvency is a very trending topic, right? A lot of the builders going bankrupt or insolvent, not just in Victoria, but across Australia, are builders who are working with owner-occupiers or homeowners. You are not seeing a lot of, development builders or builders doing high-end stuff that are going bankrupt. The first thing that we want to talk about is why are they going bankrupt, right? I think that's the key sort of notion as to what's happening in this industry where they're going bankrupt. And all of this potentially started off in 2020 during the pandemic years. Government threw a lot of funding out there, and so there was a lot of business that people were basically writing, and builders have never seen a spike like this before. There is so much business that was there to grab, and so they were writing the business left, right, and center. Now understand that if you look at the business industry, the construction prices don't go up by 10, 15, 20% every year. They go up by 2 or 3% on average. And so builders margin around 10, 15% was quite normal. If you take yourself back to like 1990s, the builders, there was this saying that the builders make the most money in any industry, and their margins used to be sitting around 30, 35%, right? And the reason was that it was a high inflationary environment. And so the builders had to protect themselves in relation to some of these inflationary pressures that they could see. Whereas the 2020 was almost like taken in by a surprise because they didn't know what is going to happen post-COVID. No one knew. And so, of course, from government's perspective, it made a lot more sense to put in as much money out there, to drive the economy. And so when they started writing these contracts, they were all profitable contracts. They were sitting at, 10, 15%, margins, right? Now, the issues basically started to eventuate when the supply side of things, started going bad. And so you had transportation issues in relation to COVID. You had supply issues in relation to COVID where there was supply constraints, not enough stock was coming in from overseas. There was constraints in relation to COVID. The prices of the transport and the freight went up by almost 3 times, in that sort of period of, 15 to 24 months. And so there was so much happening in relation to the supply chain squeeze, Ukraine war, etc. All of those things, price of materials, price of minerals, etc. All of these going up. And so for that year when the raw material prices were going up, but the shipping costs were going up, the builders could not see the building prices going up. Where everyone was talking about it, but they could not actually feel it at that time, right? And so what happened was that post that year, at the end of 2021, 22, you could see that some of this started transcending back into the supply and material costs because the wholesalers couldn't hold that increases in prices to themselves, and so they started passing it through. The interesting bit that happened was that while the material prices were going up by almost like 29 to 30% in that 1 year or 1.5 year, as people realized that, there is all these government incentives that they've been using, there was a big supply of these incentives. The prices of houses, started rising as well. And so people who were there on the fence line, they actually jumped into the business as well, and they started pushing this through. And so while the government incentives finished, the inertia of investors coming into the market continued, right? And so those contracts kept continuing. And so ultimately, all of this started breaking up, at the end of 2021, early 2022, when, the builders realized the contract that I've written a year ago, now I'm ready to build, and the price have moved by 30%, right? And so the biggest issue was not so much that the builders had this price constraint. The biggest issue was that the builders, there are 2 types of builders. There are tool-belt builders and there are astute builders. The astute builders were the one that know how to read a profit and loss, how to read a balance sheet, and they know how to run a business. I would say, unfortunately, about 70% of the building industry is tool-belt builders. They are apprentices from carpenters, plumbers, electricians who have become builders over a period of time, right? Or concrete layers, etc. And so they don't have the financial literacy at all in understanding what their profit looks like in every project, right? And so they work on a cash flow basis, cash flow coming in, cash flow going out. They wake up in the morning, they see $500,000, $1 million sitting in their bank account, and they feel happy that, they can go about doing the business, right? But when you're losing 2 to 5% on every contract, it's not a big deal. But when you start losing 10, 15% on the contract, there is always a trigger point. And that's the trigger point that started happening post 2022, where a lot of the builders started seeing that the cash flow was depleting while their lifestyle was exquisite, right? They were driving four-wheel drives and Mercedes and, all of these Hummers and all of those things. And they realized, holy shit, I actually don't have money, right, to not support my lifestyle. And so in order to give up their lifestyle, they started going for bankruptcy, because they're like, well, this is an easy solution. I'll just go bankrupt, start up a new company, and basically go on with my job, right? And as soon as the government realized some of these instances, they started taking off insurances, they started taking off the builder limits from the builders, and that's where the real collapse happened. Okay, and so you could start seeing from Metricon had to do a major injection into their own profitability. You could see builders, lapsing on the contracts, etc. Now, the funny thing is, why did the pressure only build in Victoria, not so much in the other states? In careful words, the other states were quite sort of proactive about some of these things, and they realized that these are real pressures, and it's not the builder's fault that they have been into this mess. And so they should be allowed to pass on some of these cost increases to the clients, right? Because ultimately you need to understand that a product that was $700,000 to build, including the land, is now actually $900,000 or $850,000, right? And so these people who have built just 1.5 years ago, they are back in the market because all of a sudden they're $150,000 rich, right? Because the bank's valuation have gone up. And so they're coming back into this, in this cycle quite quickly. You can see that a lot of wealth creation has happened between 2020 and 2022, where because of these price pressures, people have made a lot of money. And it's not anything to do with property market. It's supply pressures causing the prices to go up. And so ultimately, if you try combining this together, a lot of these different states, when they started thinking about some of these things, they said, okay, while these contracts are fixed price contracts, we are going to allow the builders for the first time to pass on these variations to the clients. Like any other business, you have cost pressures, you pass on those cost pressures to your retail clients. Victoria was the only state that didn't allow the builders to do that. Okay, and so all the risk stayed with the builder. The worst thing that could happen with Victoria was that Victoria, like any other state, while they were trying to push the economy, they kept going in relation to the infrastructure projects, right? And so while you had supply chain issues, you also started having labor issues, because there was no new labor coming in. And the labor that was there on the ground, they were busy with all of these infrastructure projects, which pays a lot more money than, what the building industry pays. And so that issue basically compounded. And so these builders, when you think about the builder as a person who is, on the ground, on the land, building a house, none of that was happening. The builder was potentially squeezed between a client on one side, a supplier on one side, and a tradie on one side. And so he was basically working for these three people, making no money. And so in anticipation, what the builder kept doing was that, okay, I'm having supply chain issues right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find solutions. And so instead of wood, they started jumping on steel, they started cutting corners, they started doing all of this stuff, right? And so the bigger problem is that, because they were finishing these houses so quickly, there would be a massive issues around defects that is going to happen in the next sort of 3 to 5 years that no one is talking about. And that would definitely happen because, that churn is massive, right? No house can be built in 3 to 4 months, right? And so when they were completing this, there is a lot of defects that would happen naturally in the next sort of, 3 to 5 years. And you would see some of those claims coming through as part of the Victorian or as part of the building industry. And so while they were, trying to squish in between these three places, these three players, what they tried to do was they started writing better business or much more profitable business, post 2022. And so they said, okay, we are going to, increase our margin significantly. And so we are going to start writing 20-25%, profit margins in all of our products. Right now, actually, they're writing almost up to 30%, profit margins in their products. And the reason was that they are going to make the money in the new contracts, and they're going to siphon that money into the old contracts rather than pushing in their own money. Okay. And so, yes, of course, that should have worked technically because, the profit from the front, would have come to the back. And so you could see that shift from the builders where old contracts or the loss-making contracts, there was no work being done. And person who has just signed the contract, his slab is getting laid, his frames are going up, and people are like, what's happening here? Like, I signed the contract 8 months ago and nothing has happened on my side. And this guy signed the contract last month and his house is building because ultimately the builder only gets paid from the bank once they start doing the build. And so their focus changed. And so they were making these people wait, or they were lapsing the contract. They were giving them $5,000, $10,000 and saying, look, go away, or just wait a year before we finish these new builds, and siphon the profit back into finishing your builds. The tricky bit happened in 2023 when the interest rate starts rising, or late 2022, early 2023, right? The interest rate starts rising. And so as soon as the interest rate starts rising, the new contracts that were the pipeline that was the savior for the builder, that disappeared, right? And so there's no more new contracts coming in. And so now all of a sudden, the builder is in a position where they're living a lavish lifestyle. They have a lot of loss-making contract, and there is no new good business coming through, right? And so the only way out for them was to put their hand up and say, look, I'm going to go bankrupt, okay? Now, if you think about the commonality in all of this is happening around the owner-occupier market, because that's where the influx of the builds was. That's where the government was supporting these people to build more and more houses. You're talking about house and land packages. You're talking about all of those new builds in brand new states, right? Brand new land subdivisions, etc.